So over the weekend, after much insistence from many of you, I finally caught and I finished Squid Game. I have to say, I absolutely loved the show. It is truly incredible. I don't think this is a surprise to anybody because most people I've spoken to have actually seen the show. They swear by it. And I think it is truly fascinating that despite the fact that the show is very much rooted in South Korean culture, especially the childhood games of South Korea, many of which I'm not even familiar with, I'm sure for many of you as well, yet we all enthralled by the show. It is captivating. We can relate to it somehow, despite the fact that we don't speak the language, we might not necessarily understand the culture. And I really thought about why, and I think it really breaks down to the fact that we are all actually playing a Squid Game in our lives. Now, you might think that's preposterous, as if we're playing a tug-of-war of death. But I think we are actually playing a tug-of-war of life in our lives, and we can relate to the dynamics of Squid Game. Because if you really think about it, it really speaks to our human nature in modern society and the sort of dynamics that are going on. Firstly, think about the participants of the games. Why are we so invested in them? It's because on some level, we understand and we can relate and empathize with them. The participants are playing the games, although reluctantly, because they really want to improve their lives. Of course, in this show, the participants are generally from the more marginalized aspects of society, most of them being debt-ridden. And some of us might not be able to relate to that, some of us might be able to, but the fact being that all of us, we know and we can relate to the drive to improve our lives. And in that pursuit of actually chasing that better life, a lot of us, we're so tunnel visioned that we might end up agreeing to do things that we don't necessarily want to do out of reluctance, yet the harsh realities of life. And at the same time, we can also understand how in that tunnel vision, we sometimes become blind to those around us. We're so siloed in and we're so focused on our own personal drive in the betterment of our own lives that we totally forget about those around us. And generally, we're stuck in this sort of selfish drive in this loop. And so this overall sense of chasing for better things in life and also an overall sense of selfishness, I think is something that is quite universal to many of us and in our modern societies. Of course, in Squid Game, it is very much exaggerated in a very thrilling way with this life or death game, but in our modern lives, that's exactly what we're doing. Almost all of us are competing in games of our own, games that we might not even want to be a part of, whether it is in terms of our life paths or our careers or anything really, but things that we do for the chance of actually getting that reward of a better life. And at the same time, in our pursuit, sometimes we become so caught up with it, we're not even aware of those around us that are put down, left behind. And that really is a narrative of modern life. But I think the more interesting aspect is also the idea of the game moderators. These game masters dressed in pink in the show with the mask, and of course, they hold all the authority and they're dictating the games and the rules. And the participants have to play along. And I think there's also a parallel with that in our modern society. The pink moderators that we have really is governance, if you think about it. As we are competing in the Squid Game of our modern societies, it is very much being moderated by the state in the form of the government, in the form of laws, in the form of police. They set the laws and the rules that we have to follow. And some of us on a personal level might not agree or accept these rules on a personal level, yet we can't go against it because very much like Squid Game, if we go against these moderators, these game masters and the rules, we will face the penalty. And very much like in Squid Game, in some countries that penalty is even death. But as we saw with the show, eventually, the protagonist rose against the game master and game itself. He thought it was too exploitative, and he came to really question it. And that really leaves an interesting question for us too. As we are being moderated by governments, do they truly have authority over us? Or have we been deluded in the same way that participants have in the Squid Game? Is there a basis for their authority? Have we, like the participants in Squid Game, agreed to even play a game set by them, this game of modern society? Well, it is here I think you'll find some interesting insights from the English philosophers of the 17th and 18th century, which truly, as they wrote about their thoughts, really reflects the sentiments of Squid Game. Because they were interested as well in why governing powers should exist in society, why rules and laws should exist in society, why we should show reverence to any form of moderation. And what they discovered in their deliberations is truly fascinating. To begin with, Thomas Hobbes, in the 17th century, he tried to imagine a society without any sort of governance, where everybody is free. A state of nature, as he calls it. And in imagining a society where there are no laws and no rules, where everybody is allowed to do anything that they wanted, you might think that this is a heavenly place. Nobody telling you what you cannot do. Yet according to Hobbes, life in such a state of nature would actually be poor, nasty, brutish and short. Because he believed, in the very same sense as the writer of Squid Games did, people are intrinsically quite selfish. And in pursuing their own self-interest of survival, they will totally disregard their neighbors and the people around them. And oftentimes, much more than that, people might even dispose of each other in the pursuit of their interests. In other words, there might be rampant conflicts and violence. And so for Hobbes, a state of nature like this would very quickly devolve into a state of war. Life would be basically anarchy. And because of this, in order for us to really maximize our survival and to pursue our interests in a way that doesn't involve this great uncertainty of dying at any moment, we came together to create civil society by deciding to give up our ultimate freedom to create this body known as a state, this sovereign body that would be able to set all the laws and the rules of society and moderate us so that we're able to play the game of life fairly. So in other words, we have actually signed a social contract in our pre-society to create our civil society of today. And because of that, we are all bound by the state. In other words, we have to give reverence to game masters. The state is the absolute, because we have decided that such a society is much better than a society without any sort of governance. So again, back to the Squid Game analogy, playing those games, certainly with fixed rules, would be much better than playing those games without any rules at all. It would be absolute chaos. But of course, the show itself is already very chaotic. But again, an interesting consideration that lets us really peer into the underlying working society, at least from the aspect of political thought. But as we saw in the show, the protagonist, he did ultimately come to challenge and basically rise against the moderators. He disagreed with how the games actually work and ultimately the governance of the game itself. Then is there any basis for us to do the same with our modern societies? Are we at any point, at least from a legitimate sort of standpoint, able to really stand up against the moderators, the governance of our society? Well, according to the 18th century philosopher John Locke, yes, he was slightly different from Hobbes in the sense that he also believed that there existed a state of nature. People at some point in pre-society must have been free prior to the existence of governments and the state. And of course, they were doing whatever they wanted to do. But he also believed that although laws did not exist at the time, by being human, where all of us, we do have a natural interest to want to really survive and prosper and improve our own lives, then there must be some sort of a law of nature, a universal sort of morality that would dictate that we should, at least from this moral standpoint, respect the interests of others. But of course, without actual governance, it is hard to actually make this happen. Although the ideal might be there, but of course conflicts can still happen. Therefore, again, in the very same vein as Hobbes, we have created the state to create governance as a form of social contract to really uphold our interests. And so from that basis, Locke also believed and would argue that although we must respect governance and the state, where it no longer serves our interests, then we have all the legitimacy to disregard and even overthrow the state. And the very interesting thing about Locke is that his ideas would really very much formulate into the underpinnings of liberalism and what we expect really in a democratic system of governance. Again, today, we might have laws that govern over us where we have more or less curtailed our freedom, but the idea being that these laws actually exist for our good and they serve our interests. And of course, the lawmakers are elected by us, the majority of us, and therefore we should adhere to them and respect them. But of course, if these laws are oppressive and exploitative, then such governing powers lose their mandate over us. And by all means, we would have the legitimacy to try to challenge such governance. So as you can see, many of these very interesting thoughts, they all really tie to Squid Game. And in a very real sense, all of us in our participation in modern society are playing a Squid Game in the very same way. We're all playing this game of life to hopefully have a good life. At the same time, this game is very much being run by game masters. There might come a point in time, especially if the game is too rigged, that we might all challenge such governance as well.